Hello, friends. I'm Jem Fadling, and this is the Unhurried Living Podcast, where we inspire you to rest deeper, live fuller, and lead better. Today, I'll be talking with professional counselor and best-selling author Aundi Kolber about knowing what you need, engaging life with agency, being reminded of who God created you to be, and how to cope in difficult situations. Aundi Kolber beautifully guides us into our journey by sharing her own story of early trauma. I've spoken to her before, and she truly is a compassionate and authentic person. Aundi has just released her new book, Take What You Need, Soft Words for Hard Days. It's a beautiful gift of a book of her most insightful and inviting quotes. Today, I'll be talking with her about how we unfortunately learned to suppress our own needs, how to find and engage our voice, and how trying softness can help. We'll also talk about choices, boundaries, and agency, and the importance of remembering God is with us in all things. As a survivor of trauma, Aundi brings hard-won knowledge about the work of change, the power of redemption, and the beauty of experiencing God with us in our pain. Now let's dive into my conversation with Aundi. Well, Aundi, thank you for saying yes to the Unhurried Living Podcast. It's so good to see you again.
Absolutely. It's really good to be here.
Well, I thought we would just dig right in. And I want to begin actually with the dynamic of how many of us learn early to bend to the desires or needs of other people. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, we're then suppressing our own needs. And you talk about that in your book, which we will get to. But I'd love it. Maybe can you ease us in by sharing a little bit of your own story and maybe branch over into, how do we end up doing this?
Yeah. No, great place to start. Part of my story, so I have a history of complex trauma from childhood. And when as I name that, I'm like, it's quite complex, but part of that is was a pattern through, almost 20 years of my life, where particularly my dad was, he was profoundly abusive in multiple ways. And my mom, I think partly because of her own trauma and some issues around addiction, was really not able to be really as protective as we needed. And so even though she was very loving, she wasn't able to provide a lot of safety. And so those things together were deeply harmful, because essentially, a couple of decades living in the presence of constantly having to accommodate threat, always like really organizing my whole self around staying safe. And I wouldn't have had that language when I was a kid. I don't think, and I think this tends to be really true. I've worked with, so many trauma survivors, and now, I get to hear from a lot of readers too. I think for a lot of people, they don't always have the language for something that has started before they even have memory. And so when something is so normalized, like, kind of like a fish in water, a fish isn't going to, what's the joke? Like you ask a fish, how's the water? They don't know they're in
what's
water.
What's the water?
Yeah. That's right. And I think for a lot of people who've experienced, and certainly there's lots of different kinds of trauma, but particularly I work a lot with developmental trauma, childhood trauma, complex trauma, attachment trauma. Some of these things are happening before we have like the ability to be verbal. And so it's so early in our bodies. It's been there for so long. And that has been my experience. And so, kind of moving towards the part of the question that, this idea that we learn to bend to become really sort of, I think of it like human pretzels, where we sort of innately, God designed us with the ability to constantly assess the level of safety or threat we're experiencing. And this is a gift in many respects. Like we really need it. I don't want that to go away, but when you are always living in threat, it does a lot to your body. It in many ways, it causes those systems to start to have to become on super high alert. And there is a particular trauma response called the fawn response, which is an adaptive response that doesn't necessarily like it comes as a result of other trauma responses not being effective. And so we learn this when, like, there's no, like, for example, there's no escape from the threat. You learn to over accommodate, you learn to become sort of whatever you need to become in order to deal with sort of the harm that might be present. You might be saying yes when you mean no. You might be giving more than you're okay with. You might be acting like you're totally fine when you're not fine. All of these things are a part of it. And so I think of the fawn response as very connected to this idea that this is different than the way, particularly from, when we bring in like the Christian faith tradition. I think it's really loving and a part of being human that we would care about other people. But this is different. This is coming from a place where we are perceiving such a high level of threat that we don't experience it as being safe enough to be ourselves, even if that means, potentially that the relationship itself will potentially go away if we just simply speak up for ourselves. And so this is certainly my story. This is one of many ways that I learned to adapt in my childhood to a caregiver who was profoundly unsafe and in many ways very terrifying. And so, one of the things I talk about in different places is that even when that threat passes, our body doesn't necessarily go, oh, I'm not with my dad anymore. This person will be able to treat me with respect and won't punish me just because I don't make them happy. What our bodies do is they automatically begin to transfer these ways of being in the world to other relationships, including with God. And so I think of it like having to unwind this way of being in the world where we have learned to disconnect from our emotions, disconnect from our needs, disconnect from our voice, and even our ability just to show up as our authentic self. And that there is a journey of re-inhabiting, coming home in so many ways to ourselves, to our God-given selves, which, so this newest work is, I think of it, I hope, as a resource in that process, that it would invite people to listen to what is it that you actually need and almost to bless them to listen and take what they need.
Oh, I so deeply resonate with your story and even just the process of it. I had a super complicated relationship with my mother. That's a way of saying it. And she passed away when I was relatively young, about 31. And I remember really that was a turning point in my life because I never figured out beforehand how to get out from under the domination that I felt from her. And it was so odd for me to be an adult person that felt like I didn't have the tools to have agency or to make a change inside the relationship. I never figured it out. And it's been so long. I mean, that was 30 years ago. And I've been through therapy and my therapist helped me find my voice, all the things we're going to talk about. But, now that it's been so long, I can hardly feel the depth of the trappedness, if you can say that, at the time. So maybe that's hopefulness for people that over time, God does actually repair and renew and revive. But I do remember that feeling of absolutely not knowing how to deal with her. And so I probably tried it all: fight, flight, freeze, fawn. I mean, all of it until, to just bear up under. But maybe we could shift to that idea of agency. Talk about that a little bit more. Like that, for me, I needed to find me, to find my voice. And obviously with God's help and with a really good therapist, we made headway. But maybe talk about that, finding voice, finding agency. How does that move us?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that about your own story. And yeah, I mean, I think this is in many ways more common than many of us than has been really talked about. I think it's being more talked about now, which I'm grateful for. But just this reality of what it does to a person to be unable to connect with, not because they're choosing to not connect with themselves, but because it hasn't been safe enough. It hasn't been possible. Right. And there's a lot of different reasons why that might come to be the case. But I think particularly when you've grown up with a relationship with a caregiver, a parent, sometimes it's a system. It's not only our caregivers. This can also happen in romantic relationships. This can happen in church settings. I mean, there's lots of different ways. Anything that's relational is going to have this sort of quality to it. And I think when I think about this agency piece, though, I think so many people kind of often think of this idea like all of a sudden we're like, now I have agency, versus this reality that really this work starts from our earliest breaths. This is very much connected to attachment work, that there is a way in which the way we were cared for, the way we were parented, gets deeply imprinted into who we are and who we become. And they live in us as these templates, right? About how we are going to get our needs met, how people respond when we have pain, how the world even reacts to us. This is all connected to sort of those early relationships. And then over time, they expand into other relationships. And I think the reason I start there is to say that in a way, part of the goal of an attachment relationship in childhood is that we would come to internalize sort of this like a good enough parent, that we would ultimately sort of carry it around with us so that when we're no longer essentially being parented, that we become sort of our own parent in a way. And this happens, like, this is where agency, I mean, certainly, again, it's not like this light switch, but it's the development over time. And that ultimately it's like we're given all these tools, over time, and it builds into a way of existing where we can say, here's what I think. Here's my decision. Here's what I've thought through. Here's what I'm okay with. Here's what I'm not okay with. Here are people that I feel good being around. And here are people that, God bless them, but I think I'm going to do something else, right? Like all of these ways, like this is evidence of agency. But if we take a different route, which is that we are not given good enough care, we are never given permission to feel our feelings. We are denied the capacity to develop skills like, some healthy independence, to be able to try things, where we are required to be parentalized to take care of our parents rather than develop our own sort of self, where we are required to make sure everyone else in the family is okay before we even think about if we're okay, right? So you think about how different those kinds of experiences shape us, because that will deeply impact our ability as adults to tap into the agency that I think many people want other people to have, right? And we sometimes want for ourselves. What we don't always discuss is everything underneath that builds the framework, right? Including even just having a self with God. Like even recognizing that, God invites us to participate in our own healing. Like we are part of that process. And so when I think about this agency piece, I think it's often overlooked as this essential piece that we get to be part of this. It's not just happening to us.
Yes, I'll just say yes to that. There's so much in what you're saying there. And when you're talking about self with God, the first thing that popped into my mind was the classic practice of silence and solitude. I really give that practice credit for for buoying me along the journey, even though I still had to walk the long, hard journey of all the things, the therapy and the working through and the healing. There was this way in which silence and solitude is that beautiful way where you could give yourself some extra time to linger in God's presence, right? I really feel like that opened up something inside of me with God. And as I practiced with Him, then I think the safety increased with people, and there's a back and forth. Sometimes if I would have an increase with people, then maybe I can feel that with God. I know that it goes both ways, but I really do feel as though as I put myself in that listening posture with God, and I was as vulnerable as I knew how to be at the time, or as listening as I knew how to be at the time, it really paved the way. Do you think that kind of connection helps?
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think that's beautiful. And the language that I would maybe connect that with is co-regulating with God. And sometimes I use the language of of being curious about, does faith feel like a resource to whoever to you or to whoever I'm speaking with? Or I think all of us have the opportunity to I think to really get curious about that from a level of, not from a place of shame, like you're good if it does feel like a resource and you're bad if it doesn't, right? Because I think that sometimes happens for people. There can feel like, I believe in God and I want God to be a resource. And so I feel like I have to act like it's more supportive than it is.
Ah,
Versus if we can be honest and recognize, and there's lots of different reasons for why that might be. In my own story, faith practices were connected to harmful experiences that I have. It wasn't as simple, right? It wasn't just clean. And for some people, it will be more clean, which is beautiful. But if we can have an honest, look at that, then we sort of can make decisions based off of sort of the truth of that. And so when and I a lot of times use that language, faith as a resource, but you can get more specific, like sitting in solitude and silence of God's presence, feels like a resource. That's beautiful. That's amazing. Because when we think about resources, and this is the definition I use, is anything that communicates safety to our body in the present. And I borrow that from the work of Dr. Ariel Schwartz. And I really love that definition because it is very tangible. Here is why it's a resource. It's because our body is and really by extension, our spirits, ourselves are experiencing a certain level of support from that. And when we are in a healing process, it's not that it's not that discomfort is always bad, but we want to make sure we have enough support so we can tolerate the discomfort. And so I love how you talk about that, because I think we can get really curious and really honor where we do experience those resources. Because what I hear from you is the way that bolstered you, almost like it was strengthening your sense of safety, which then was feeding into your ability to sometimes then connect with other people or connect with your therapist or to keep going in your own healing work. And what I think is really cool about this work for people who are listening, who maybe for some reason, some parts of their faith don't always feel like a resource, is to know any sort of entrance into safety has the potential to bolster other areas where we're seeking to grow, so part of my story is my relationship with my husband, which I have experienced is very safe, really helped me revisit my experience of God in a different way. And it's it's interesting to me how these things work in us. And I think in my opinion, I think it's God's goodness that when something is truly good, it cannot help but bear really good fruit.
if you're watching this on YouTube, this is the book. And I already told Aundi before we pressed record. I just think it's beautiful. It's a gift of a book, but it's also a book you can gift because it's gorgeous. I mean, if you're looking, I mean, it's colorful, it's beautiful. What I love about it, it's very small bites. On this page right here, there's literally one sentence. And so there's something very soulful and spacious about it. It's called Take What You Need, Soft Words for Hard Days. And maybe attaching a little bit to your previous book, Try Softer. This is a rough culture we're living in right now. We're in North America. Even as a planet, it's just, there's a lot of contempt, social media. I mean, we could make the list. It's a lot. I'm wondering, can we bring in, because this is so beautiful, how could engaging softness in a hard time help us right now? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, first, thank you for your kind words about the book. And I'm really loving how it turned out. And it just feels, I felt a lot of joy just knowing, like seeing the tangibleness of it. That feels really good. And
beautiful.
Yeah. And I just think, something I often say is, the harder the season, the more gentle we will have to become. And, I think when I first said that sentence, it's probably been about 5 years. I think I said, we'll have to become with ourselves. And I think part of that is, and to me, I really tap into Jesus's words that we love our neighbor as ourselves. And in so many respects, I think part of being able to show up to a world like ours is that we do what we can. We're not going to do it perfectly. And let's just validate the reality of how hard it is, because it's pretty rough in this world right now and in North American culture. And I think that that's valid, like, it's not like we need to just, and I think this is what I appreciate about what you're saying is that we don't want to bypass that or just, like any of those things. And so in the midst of a lot of hard, what so many of us have been taught is buckle down, push even harder, and just whatever it takes, like pedal to the metal, deplete yourself, all of those things. And let me just say, it's not that hard work or effort doesn't matter. It certainly doesn't mean like showing up to what we're experiencing in the world isn't going to require anything of us. But I do think that we have to, just like we were talking about earlier, we have to have some connection to safety. We have to participate and partake in some of that goodness in so many respects to be able for that to come through, to be able to love our neighbor as ourselves. And that way in which it is a paradox, I think so many of us, particularly if you're like me, if you have a story where it's, you see someone in pain and you're like, I just want to alleviate that pain, regardless of the implications for me. Now, that isn't, not that that's all bad, but if I live that way, if that is the pattern from which I always exist, I am not going to be doing this work very long. Right. And so when we learn to sort of come from that, I think of love your neighbor as yourself. There's sort of this ebb and a flow to that. Yeah. There's a way in which, there's a reciprocity to saying, I also get to participate in what I need. I also get to know that I am a limited, finite human. And my work is to show up as much as I can to this work or to my life or to the relationships I have. But I also have to trust that it's not all my work only. And so I think that's sort of the ethos of Take What You Need, is that, that it would sort of be like, come and just inviting people to be nourished and to know that, that we are more than invited to do that, that there's nothing that's not selfish, that we in and of itself are worthy of that care. And the result cannot help but be that we will better love our neighbors.
Yeah. Now, of course, you're preaching to the choir. Now, I mean, that's what we love to talk about here. It's the care of souls is critical because it's John 15. It's the much fruit that lasts, right? We're an organic being that is being loved and nurtured, and then fruit can be born from that. And very often we talk about how people are trying to, glue plastic fruit on a tree because it has to look like something. Where in fact you could, as a gardener or farmer, think of an orchard. I mean, they're planting seeds, they're tilling the soil, they're watering, they're planting where the sun is the right, whatever. And yet a person doesn't know how to make an apple, right?
Right. Yeah.
God makes apples, but the farmer does all the things. And I think what you're talking about is, loving others as yourself. There's a place in which it starts in here, and then it's able over time to become more like a flourishing or a fruit bearing, which is so much more, I don't know, ultimately free. I mean, freeing. I think if we can move into, and I know, and I speak from experience, it's taken me a lifetime to feel more in the flow of that because again, stops and starts and traumas and unhealth, but we all make our way. And I think maybe what we both, I sense from you too, that heart of, we just want to help people see where they are. And can you discern that as best you can with proper support, maybe, and then move forward graciously into who God has made you to be, and then flourish. I mean, I think we're all trying to maybe do that, but it's complicated. It's easy to say.
Said. Yeah, no, but well said. And I think even what you said about, gluing on fake fruit because, right, because, yeah, I mean, I think all of us want to be flourishing, right? And we, in many ways, others like it to see that we're flourishing. But sometimes the pressure to be flourishing when really what you need is to be in a season that might look a little bit more bare on the outside, right? That the outside is looking like, you've just been pruned. But what's happening is so much life inside that is actually going to be able to come out. And I think, that in a world like ours and the folks a lot of the folks I work with, it's like they have cared so deeply about people and they have found that they become deeply depleted, or maybe they have been harmed because they didn't have the ability to set the boundary that they needed to. So they were ultimately taken advantage of, or they were told when they tried to take care of themselves, how they tried finally, maybe for the first time they tried, I'm going to take care of themselves. And then they were shamed, or they were told, you're so selfish. I can't believe that you would only think about yourself. And so I think the continued discussion of the narration of, no, we ourselves also must, and I mean this in every respect, even neurobiologically, be a part of the work we're doing. Because without that, there is no path for the healing to take traction. And so for so many of us, we get to the point where maybe we've burnt out from being able to over accommodate others, over function. And then there's just shame. Because the one thing that made you feel like you were lovable, which was maybe being helpful or showing up or working hard, isn't possible anymore, or not in the same way. And so I think there can be a lot of grief to that, first and foremost, when you begin to see that. But I think also it can begin to be an invitation. And in a way, in my own life and my own work, I mean, I came to that place relatively at a pretty young age. I was 28 when my daughter was born. She's now 13. And I think in particular, because of the childhood that I had, my body was already really depleted. I had been living in depletion for so long that when I tried to parent from that place, it was like there was nothing else to pull from. My body said, white knuckling, I can't white knuckle this. Like it was like I kind of wanted to and I couldn't. And it's like it began to be the recognition of the invitation. Like instead of the shame of, oh, I'm not meeting expectations, what would it be like to soften that posture?
We are definitely fearfully and wonderfully made, aren't we? And it's so fascinating because I went through therapy probably about 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago, and we weren't talking as much about neuroscience at the time and neurobiology, and yet under the hands of a skilled therapist who probably knew all about that, but he wasn't using those words. He was still able to guide me. And so I guess I want to say to the people listening too, you don't always have to know the current lingo to be a part of your own healing. I didn't have all the vocabulary or all the knowledge about all the things that were going on, but I was still able to receive deep healing. And just from my own perspective as just a woman, I just knew that I was determined. I was determined. I was willing to look under any rock, to look into any memory, to be as vulnerable as I could be because I wanted so desperately to change. I didn't want to be stuck in the ways I was. And so even though I didn't now, I mean, everybody's talking about your body and your brain and, and which is great. I love knowing about all this stuff, but it works even if you don't fully understand. If you're again, I had the blessing of being with a super skilled, experienced, sort of spirit-filled counselor who held my heart and my soul just gently and walked me through all of it. So I'm just thankful that people like that exist, people like you exist, who can journey with us as we make our way. And so I'm wondering, we've talked about a lot of things, but is there anything that we haven't talked about or a topic that it was in your heart, even when you wrote your book, that you wanted to bring up and encourage us with or help us with?
Yeah. Well, I do want to just briefly say, thank you for saying that. And I think there are so many doors in to the healing. And I just love what you're naming around. I think just that's a God-given desire, to heal. I often think of when Paul talks about like all creation groans, like that we are designed for wholeness. Like that is the desire in us. And I love that. And I think what's cool is whether you look at the neuroscience, which I just like to geek out because of how interesting it is of how it connects, but whether that's helpful to you or it's not, that's okay. Because part of this work is, I almost think about it like being on your own team, right? Like God's on your team. You probably have a lot of people who are already on your team. And it's almost like you get to be on your team too. And when I think about this work and I think about your listeners and all of this, I mean, I think that was one of the main things that I was thinking about as I was putting these things together. Because some of these are quotes from Try Softer and Strong Like Water and some of my practices. And then it really leads, with sort of like imagery and botanical and really wanting to just create an experience for the reader, for the person holding it, that helps them to say, you are invited, like you get to listen. Participating with the spirit, you get to listen to what you need. And almost like a banquet, like God has set a big table, but we're not telling you, I'm not here to tell you what you need. I trust the wisdom of your body that God put in your body. And that's what I love about what you just said, because that's what I hear is that you were living from a deep wisdom. And the deep wisdom was, no, there's more healing for me. And when you were experiencing that in the presence of that therapist, with the therapist, that sort of deep calls to deep. there was a sense of, this is the thing I've been looking for. Right. And so it's my hope and my prayer that this is part of the resources for people that might help them as they weave together their own practices and their own way of moving through the world that helps them to develop that agency, that witness, that ability to show up and know it's not just love your neighbor, it's love your neighbor as yourself.
So good. I'm wondering if there's a maybe just a really brief little prayer practice or some body thing that you know about that you could help. Someone in the middle of their day, they catch themselves feeling extra stressed, or their shoulders are hunched, or they've got a pit in their stomach. Is there something you can help us do in just a couple of minutes that might help us just get gentle real quick and then move forward?
Yeah. Well, okay, let me think about that for a moment. There are several, and one that comes to mind is an adapted version of what's called a meta prayer. So it's like a loving kindness prayer. And so, sometimes this can be adapted, but I do it in Try Softer, and it's also in Take What You Need. And so a meta prayer I love because it sort of is all about compassion. It's all about building compassion. And so, we can, for a person listening, I might just invite you to take a moment and maybe feel your feet underneath you and feel yourself seated on your seat if you are, or if you're walking or moving, just kind of taking a moment to ground yourself in the space you're in. And then I often like to invite people, if it feels comfortable to them, to maybe place a hand on their chest or their stomach, just as a way to communicate some support. And for this meta prayer, this is something you could just say in your mind's eye. And oftentimes I'll start just with myself. May I experience Christ's presence. May I experience Christ's love. May I experience Christ's goodness. So just taking a moment. And then you can adapt that. You could even put in something like, may my neighbors experience Christ's love. May my neighbors experience Christ's presence. May my neighbors experience Christ's goodness. And so as you do this, part of what you're just noticing is the presence with yourself and any softening. And with this, what I love about this sort of meta prayer, I mean, you can adapt it lots of different ways. You can just sit with that if it feels good. You can add more language. You can go down the list of people that you love. This can be a way of praying. But what we're also doing is, we can even do this, when Jesus talks about loving your enemies. This can be a version of, what does that look like? And for trauma survivors, I always like to ask, just like, is faith a resource? Is that is that okay for you? Right? We're always doing this from a place of honoring. We're not asking ourselves to bypass, but it's a way of softening our heart and even opening our heart and being willing just to receive. So that's a practice that I go over in Take What You Need. And yeah, if it's helpful, it's one of those things that I just invite people to.
Oh, good. I love the words. And even just having you guys, I mean, I went through it with you even right now, just hearing your voice and the way your posture shifted and your voice and the tone, love, presence, and goodness. And those are such rich and full like intentions and blessings. And so even in just that brief minute, I felt it. So I'm hoping other people will as well. And so I just thank you so much, Aundi, so much goodness here. And Is there anything else you wanted to say before we wrap up? Is there anything that I didn't ask you that you would love to say to us?
Well, thank you for checking in. I just want to say thank you for having me and just appreciate your perspective and just, your lived experience in so much of this work. And I'm grateful to get to be here with you.
Yeah, I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining me on the Unhurried Living Podcast. You can download free resources and learn more about us at unhurriedliving.com. If you haven't already, please subscribe, and I'd love it if you'd share this podcast with your friends and colleagues. You'll also find many helpful links in the show notes so you can get to know us better, as well as our partner, Life Audio, and all of their other faith-centered podcasts. Remember, you're making your way forward one small, simple, and gracious step at a time.